To Western audiences, the 2011 anime Penguindrum is a mystery, and not just in terms of genre. Its director, Ikuhara Kunihiko, is known for making shows crammed full of symbolism, allegory, and enough bizarre quirks to keep even the most proficient media analyst busy. Still, Penguindrum in particular is hard to follow, at least to anyone who isn't Japanese. I know I struggled with it when I first watched it. Looking back on it now, after a couple years of researching the show, a lot of its messaging is obvious. I just wasn't familiar with the history it was drawing on. This video will introduce the events that Penguindrum is commenting on, and explain why the show plays out the way it does. While Ikuhara works always contain head-scratching moments and silly asides, Penguindrum is ultimately a very intentional work. There's a method to its madness. Penguindrum Episode 1 sets up the world and characters. Starting with a grounded human story, it soon veers off into fantasy. 3 teenage siblings, surnamed Takakura, are living together in Tokyo. They converse cheerfully over breakfast, but something isn't right. They have no parents, for one, and it's quickly revealed that the younger sister, Himari, is terminally ill. Her older brothers Kamba and Shoma put on happy faces for her sake, but are deeply troubled inside. On a family trip to the aquarium, Himari collapses and dies. There's nothing the brothers can do. They stand by her body in shock and grief. When confronted by Shoma, Kamba posits that her death may have been a punishment for them. It's this moment that puts into motion the supernatural events of the show. Himari wakes, wearing a penguin hat her brother bought her from the aquarium gift shop. She isn't herself. She's possessed by some entity, and that entity tells the brothers to seek the Penguindrum if they want their sister's life to be saved. This quest is dubbed a survival strategy. So we have our basic setup. Himari is the innocent younger sister, a damsel who must be saved by her devoted brothers. Despite the show going off in other strange directions, I was still on board with it my first watch. The introduction of the character Ringo did me a lot of favors, since I found her hilarious. She has her own parallel survival strategy, seeking to force reality to fit the prophecies written in a diary she keeps. However, I was completely nonplussed at the twists introduced halfway through the show. I was prepared for the story to be a mystery full of character exploration, but all of a sudden, it became something else. After going through many trials together, Ringo opens up to Shoma, saying that the diary belonged to her sister, who was murdered in a terrorist attack. Shoma replies that the murder is his family's fault, because his parents were terrorists involved in carrying out the attack. What? My confusion was caused by my ignorance of the show's subject matter. I would imagine that Japanese viewers were making guesses from episode 1, and certainly wouldn't have been shocked by the time of the reveal. But I'm an American who is only vaguely familiar with the topic at hand. In order to go any further, the history must be understood. On March 20th, 1995, members of a Japanese religious cult known as Om Shinrikyo released sarin gas on 3 lines of the Tokyo subway system. 13 people died that day, with others dying later from their injuries. In total, over 1,000 people were damaged by the gas to varying degrees. Although this was not Ohm's first terrorist attack, it was heavily publicized due to the widespread panic it caused, marking it as one of the most important disasters in post-war Japanese history. Penguindrum was not hiding the fact that it was going to be about the sarin gas attack. There were clues planted in the show from the very beginning. In the opening sequence, the number 95 is featured prominently. March 20th is later highlighted as an important date to Ringo's family, and the show centers on the Tokyo subway system, with the characters traveling on the very lines that were hit in the attack. To translate this to an American context, it's like if the show was set in Lower Manhattan and referenced September 11th, 2001. Not exactly hard to figure out. But since I'm not Japanese, and wasn't even born yet at the time of the event, I had heard of Om only vaguely, through the manga 20th Century Boys by Urasawa Naoki. Its friend cult was largely inspired by Om. The sarin attacks and the Ulm cult have had a large influence on Japanese pop culture, so Penguindrum is certainly not alone in its subject matter. Its approach, however, sets it apart. The show takes place in the year it came out, 2011, 16 years after the attack. A majority of the main characters were born on March 20th, 1995, as it occurred. In the present timeline, the cult has been mostly disbanded. Now, the children growing up in the wake of the disaster have to find a way to live their lives. Most Ulm-inspired stories I've seen make the cult into an antagonist that must be defeated. In 20th Century Boys, the cult literally goes on to take over the world. While Penguindrum does feature the charismatic cult leader Sanetoshi as a villain, it doesn't center on a simple good versus evil narrative. Instead, the show seeks to parse out the social causes of such disasters. Now that the story's aims are established, let's take a closer look at its details. First of all, there are key differences between what happened in real life and Penguindrum's depiction of events. For instance, instead of using sarin gas, the cultists in the show bombed the subway. Ulm did attempt some bombings during its sordid history, but nothing on that scale. This change may have been made to avoid disrespecting victims, or it may have been done to create distance between reality and fantasy. Rather than focus solely on Ulm, Penguindrum draws on many different trends to create its social landscape. For instance, it comments on capitalistic healthcare. Himari is sick, and her struggling family does not have enough money to pay for her treatment. In the words of the villain Sanetoshi, every day, the market sorts the lives of children around the world into those who are saved and those who aren't. The child broiler metaphor, introduced later in the show, takes these themes to a whole new level, portraying Japanese society as tossing aside its most vulnerable members. Unneeded children are recycled, ground up into glass, representing spiritual death where individuality is annihilated. The characters of Penguindrum were not only born into the aftermath of the terrorist attack, but also Japan's economic bubble burst. The 1980s were a time of great excess for the nation, only for it to all come crashing down in 1992. A great deal of development was wasted, infrastructure going unused. Penguindrum directly references Hashima, which is the holy grail of urban decay. More broadly, Penguindrum is a story set at the end of history, a term used to describe the sense that neoliberal capitalism is the endpoint of human development, with no other options available. The failure of the 1970s student movements had a big impact on director Ikuhara, who felt that despair about the possibility for social change set in at that point, and people became unable to imagine a better future. Penguindrum, with its themes of fate and not being able to amount to anything, sets out to explore these trends. Penguindrum includes all these other factors so as not to focus solely on Ulm. However, as is the case with the best kinds of social commentary, all its disparate elements come together to make a cohesive whole. To further understand Penguindrum's take on Japanese society, let's look into one of its biggest literary influences, the writing of Murakami Haruki. Penguindrum directly references Murakami's short story, Super Frog Saves Tokyo, in episode 9. Perhaps this work is referenced because it features a magical talking animal who expects an everyday guy to help him save a city from disaster. Whatever the case, this is the first clue that Penguindrum draws on the works of Murakami specifically. Other analysts have written about the influence of Murakami's novel Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World on Penguindrum. While I haven't read that particular novel, it's interesting to note that Penguindrum explores its character's psychology using the same motif of subterranean spaces that Murakami does. Rather than focus on fiction, I'm going to discuss a non-fiction book by Murakami that seems to have been the sociological basis for Penguindrum: Underground, The Tokyo Gas Attack and the Japanese Psyche. The book includes 60 interviews with victims of the sarin gas attack and concludes with Murakami's analysis of the event. He originally wanted to include the victims' perspectives only, stating that they were overlooked by the media, which reported on the event in flattened and sensationalized terms. He gave his interviewees the chance to voice their frustration with the media, as well as the systemic failure to prevent the attack and respond to it once it had occurred. Later on, however, the book was updated to include 10 interviews with former ohm members, as Murakami believed that their side of the story might be illuminating. None of the individuals he interviewed were involved in the gas attacks, but he did profile the perpetrators based on publicly available information. With this book in hand, we can begin to parse the show's meaning more thoroughly. Underground includes the perspectives of many different people from many different backgrounds. Despite the wide range of voices, one particular theme came to dominate the book. If Japanese society leaves the issue at "Ohm was evil" and does nothing to investigate the deeper causes of extremism, then the problem of cults will persist, and similar events will occur again. Taking the narrative as a whole, Penguindrum is an attempt to explore whether, 16 years after the sarin gas attack, conditions in Japan have changed such that violent extremism is no longer a threat. While the show centers less on the original perpetrators and victims, and more on the aftermath of the attack, Underground clearly provided the foundation for Penguindrum's social commentary. Let's start by examining the portrayal of the cult in the show. It's important to remember that the characters of Penguindrum are not one-to-one recreations of real people. In fact, it might be better to say that it's hard to forget this. Sanetoshi could be thought of as a representation of Ohm's leader, Asahara Shoko. There are some surface-level similarities. Sanetoshi is a doctor, and Asahara was at least interested in the medical field, having owned a Chinese medicine shop. However, he was never a practicing doctor. There's also the issue of religion. Penguindrum does not dwell on the cult's actual beliefs, yet it does still make reference to them. Asahara combined Eastern and Western traditions with doomsday prophecies to create his own new religion. Such New Age cults were common in Japan during the 80s and 90s, but Asahara gradually led his followers towards extremism by throwing everything at the wall and seeing what would stick. Many Ohm members believed that the world would end or be completely remade at the end of the millennium. While Asahara used a variety of different religious pretexts to justify his megalomaniacal plans, the most prominent was Buddhism. Underground describes how the Vajrayana belief system was manipulated to equate enlightenment with murder. An ex-Ohm member analyzed Asahara's Buddhist rhetoric as follows. Gautama Buddha said, "The self is the true master of the self," and "keep the self an island, approaching nothing." In other words, Buddhist disciples practice asceticism in order to find the true self. They find impurities and attachments and attempt to extinguish these. But what Mr. Matsumoto, Asahara, did was equate the self and attachments. He said that in order to get rid of the ego, the self must be disposed of as well. Humans love the self, so they suffer, and if the self can be discarded, then a shining true self will emerge. But this is a complete reversal of Buddhist teachings. The self is what should be discovered, not discarded. Terrorist crimes like the gas attack result from this process of easily giving up the self. If the self is lost, then people will become completely insensitive to murder and terrorism. Asahara's poisonous teachings were potent. An ex-follower noted how the organization maintained a high level of disdain for those who lived ordinary lives, the unenlightened who were not committed to the elimination of the self. In Penguindrum, such attitudes are also expressed by Sanetoshi. In episode 23, he reveals his motives, stating that humans are stuck inside the box of the self, unable to reach one another. They live in conformity and compliance, and thus have created a frozen, uncaring world. He's come to hate this world, and believes that, because he's seen through it, he's chosen, enlightened and above others. However, in actuality, he's unable to get out of his box or escape from the curse of history. This is why he's such a bitter and hateful person. All he can do is destroy others' hope of happiness, as he's destroyed his own. That's Penguindrum's representation of a charismatic cult leader, a man who would commit mass murder simply to relieve his unrelenting alienation. What about the rank and file? Despite the fact that almost every victim interviewed in Underground held anger against those who followed Asahara's orders, they still acknowledged a distinction between the leader and his followers. Ohm's leadership was largely drawn from the super elite. One ex-member remarked that Asahara favored graduates of the prestigious Tokyo University, successful scientists, researchers, and doctors who threw everything away to join a cult. Seemingly, they had been rewarded by society, so why would they give up that reward, and why would they reject that society? In Underground, Murakami posited that these individuals did not become extremists despite their elite backgrounds, but because of them, claiming that what the higher-ups had in common was a desire to put the technical skill and knowledge they'd acquired in the service of a more meaningful goal. They felt that under the inhumane, utilitarian gristmill of capitalism, their own essence and efforts, even their own reasons for being, would be fruitlessly ground down. For instance, Ikkyo Hayashi, a sarin gas perpetrator, was a former doctor who described at length his desire for a perfect utopian society, which he believed Ohm was capable of producing. Many of the lower-ranking, non-elite members that Murakami interviewed had similar feelings. Some were from troubled backgrounds, others had lived normal lives, but all described being disconnected from modern materialist society, whether due to their religious and philosophical beliefs or because of their concern for suffering and inequality. One ex-member stated that he admired Ohm because, unlike other movements, they practiced what they preached. Joining Ohm required significant sacrifices, and most members did not lead easy or comfortable lives. In a time when the rest of society was clinging to possessions, Ohm taught that one should renounce the world. That was a large part of its appeal. Others said that they felt that Ohm was the only group acknowledging the unfairness of society, saying things such as, "What I liked most about the Ohm books was that they clearly stated the world is evil. I was happy when I read that. I'd always thought the world was unfair and might as well be destroyed, and here it was, all laid out in black and white." Asahara and his followers exploited this antipathy. Members were taught that, if they did what they were told and followed the correct path, society would be remade into something better. Like all cults, Ohm Shinrikyo encouraged members to give up their individual will to their charismatic leader. Certain members were drugged and even tortured in the name of this goal. Murakami's interviewees often described how their sense of right and wrong was corroded, and though none of them were involved in terrorism, they understood how others had gotten to that point. One man claimed that, under such conditions, people just don't have the mental stamina to connect their actions with the deaths of many people. Due to the abusive actions of the cult, the media claimed that it was brainwashing members. Ohm was explained away with a kind of science fiction narrative. People were inexplicably controlled by the cult's evil power. However, even ex-members who were treated terribly by the cult told Murakami that they didn't regret their time with Ohm. The reason for this was simple. In Ohm, they'd had something they'd never found in the rest of society, a community working towards a common goal. Even if the leadership of Ohm veered off in terrible directions, most of the membership only hoped to make the world a better place. They were able to build friendships with like-minded people, with some even comparing the feeling they got to that of a family. Thus, Murakami ended his analysis by stating that most Ohm members were not very different from normal people, only differing in being especially sensitive, socially anxious, or concerned about the state of the world. These themes are reflected in Penguindrum. The elite element can be seen in the father of Kamba and Masako. The Natsume patriarch, his own father, was a powerful man in the business world. Masako explains her father's separation from the family by saying that he was tormented by the attitude that only the greedy will be rewarded by society. We don't see much of the character, but it's clear that he chose to join the cult Penguin Force because he felt that it was a better option than becoming a new capitalist overlord. The only other prominent cult members portrayed are the Takakura parents. They don't seem to be from an elite background, though they may be. Whatever the case, it's clear that they're fanatics entirely devoted to the cause. On the very day his son was born, Takakura Kinzen carried out a terrorist attack, as if he was unable to understand that he was hurting innocent people and endangering his own young family. On the way to initiate the attack, he muttered to himself, "Finally, the world will know peace." The show depicts him as a man so disconnected from reality that he truly believes that mass murder will fix society's problems. In a cryptic retelling of the events by Shoma in episode 13, the Takakura father is cast as a man fooled by the black bunnies, who represent Sanetoshi. In this fairy tale version of the story, Takakura Kenzen acts as a kind of Prometheus, stealing fire from the gods to make up for the loss of an apple tree. Apples are a very important symbol in Penguindrum, representing communion and the sharing of life. Thus, Takakura Kenzen was motivated by the feeling that society no longer has any humanity, and therefore it must be cleansed by flame. This language mirrors rhetoric used by the sarin gas attack perpetrators, who referred to their actions as a holy war fought for salvation. In episode 20, we see that the Takakura father's concern for society is not fake. He is genuinely upset by the hierarchical system of capitalism and by the way that children are being thrown away. However, despite his crimes being plain for all to see, he hasn't rethought his actions, instead doubling down and keeping the cult going. In real life, Ulm has renamed itself to Alf, and in the show, Penguin Force becomes known as Kiga Group. Takakura Kenzen's failure in thinking is revealed during the conversation he has with his son Shoma. Shoma's friend Himari has been taken away because she's an unwanted child. The father seems truly saddened, but his only solution is to continue the work of the Kiga Group. Before he can go off into another delusion, however, his son has left him. Shoma's innate understanding of the world tells him that if his friend is in danger, he needs to do something now, not wait on some long-term scheme to turn society upside down. Clearly, Takakura Kenzen was a misguided man, and worse, a criminal responsible for the deaths of many people. His wife, who supported him and must have been involved to some level, is also guilty. Despite this, they're portrayed as ideal parents, almost to the point of parody. Why did the show choose to make its central family internally loving, but outwardly destructive? Still today in Japan, the issue of Ulm is controversial. Ikuhara has discussed in interviews how just using the sarin gas attack as a basis for commercial fiction could rightly be criticized. Thus, going into the creation of Penguindrum, the staff were well aware that they were treading on dangerous ground. Rather than come out and state their aims at the start, they hinted at them to keep up the intrigue and draw people in. As we already established, Penguindrum did leave fairly obvious clues as to its subject matter. The real shock is that the Takakura family was intimately involved in the terrorist attack. This is the most subversive element of the show. Essentially, the viewer is first anchored in what they believe to be the stable normality of the Japanese family, only to discover that this stable normality hides terrible secrets. And, notably, the Takakura parents are far more loving people, on an interpersonal level, than many of the other adults depicted. That's not to say that the story excuses them. What it does is force the audience to reckon with the points that Murakami made in Underground. Extremism doesn't come from nowhere, but instead arises from society's normal functions, and cult members may be those most concerned with challenging the injustice of the world. Moving away from the Takakura parents, their children are left to struggle with the unfairness of the world on their own. Children of Ulm members were often raised in the cult and given special educations, but after the attack, many were separated from their families, as we see in the show. With the children living parentless, what conclusions will they come to? Himari is terminally ill, which the Takakura brothers privately fear is punishment for their family's sins. They're in a situation where, before they were even born, their fates were determined. They have to deal with the aftermath of their parents' actions, as well as the terrible position they've been left in. The repeated monologues given by the Takakura brothers regarding fate mirror a passage from Underground, where an ex-Ulm member discusses his anger at reality. You say the world is unfair, but in what way? Well, things like inborn talent, family background. No matter what the situation, bright people are bright, people who can run fast, and people who are weak never see the light of day. There's an element of fate that I thought was too unfair. Interestingly, there may also be parallels drawn between the Takakura siblings and victims of the sarin gas attack. Many victims spoke about feeling that their futures had been stolen from them. One specific example is of a devoted brother whose sister was badly hurt by the gas. On page 86, the following plea is made. What had his earnest, gentle, devoted sister, who asked nothing more than a little corner of happiness, ever done to be struck down by those people? It may seem a bit flagrant to make this connection between real-life victims and the fictional children of the perpetrators. However, it is true that many innocent children were harmed through unwitting involvement with Ulm. Additionally, Penguindrum doesn't only portray the children of perpetrators, but also focuses on the victim side of things through the character of Momoka. Momoka was Ringo's older sister, who was murdered in the subway bombing. Ringo was born on the day of the attack and never got to know her, but she is remembered by her parents, as well as her childhood friends, Tabuki and Yuri. Momoka is a mysterious character who makes several appearances in the show, both in flashbacks and in fantasy sequences. Sanetoshi seems to have been obsessed with her. He understood immediately on seeing her that they were the same kind of person, special, yet she would not work with him, instead choosing to oppose him. She appears to have had a power which allowed her to change the world through self-sacrifice. She significantly improved the lives of her friends Tabuki and Yuri, literally changing reality for them. This power comes to be the object of desire for every character in the show. It was destroyed in the terrorist bombing, and ever since then, the world has been on the wrong track. Thus, Momoka is a stand-in for everything that was lost in the bombing, a representation of the longing to remake the world into a better place. She's explicitly tied to Himari as well. One possible reading of Himari's Princess of the Crystal persona is that she's being taken over by Momoka's spirit. Whatever the case, it's clear that the characters are tied together. Himari is the new innocent lamb for the slaughter, though this time, there's a sick sort of justice in it, as if her death will atone for Momoka's murder. But to her brothers, Himari is a representation of innocence and purity, as much as Momoka was to her own friends. Perhaps if Himari can be saved, the world isn't irredeemable, and Momoka's spirit will be able to rest. Thus, the show hinges on Himari's life and death. Will the past repeat itself, or will the brothers be able to atone for their family's crimes? Like Underground, Penguindrum takes for granted that Ulm's actions were terrible, and doesn't spend its time dwelling on the cult's sensational aspects. Murakami argued that the media framed Ulm as them, and the rest of society as us. Ulm's crimes were incomprehensible, and could only have come from evil, insane, diseased people, in contrast to the good, sane, and healthy society. He didn't necessarily disagree with this, as in, he didn't argue that Ulm was not evil, insane, or diseased. He simply said that such statements did not get to the root of the issue. Rather than write sermons, Murakami settled on this conclusion. A little while after the events, a thought occurred to me. In order to understand the reality of the Tokyo gas attack, no study of the rationale and workings of them, the people who instigated it, would be enough. Necessary and beneficial though such efforts might be, wasn't there a similar need for a parallel analysis of us? Wasn't the real key, or part of a key, to the mystery thrust upon Japan by them, more likely to be found hidden under our territory? We will get nowhere as long as the Japanese continue to disown the Ulm phenomenon as something completely other, an alien presence viewed through binoculars on the far shore. Unpleasant though the prospect might seem, it is important that we incorporate them, to some extent, within that construct called us, or at least within Japanese society. Penguindrum returns to the same questions, almost 2 decades later. We've already gone over how the main characters are dogged by a sense of fruitlessness and despair, arising from the way their lives have been shaped by events beyond their control. But how is society in general portrayed? There is a clear us versus them division. Penguindrum portrays its background characters as faceless and featureless. The white signpost people stand in contrast to the Kiga group members, who wear all black, but notably, these figures are just as anonymous, given neither faces nor names. A point is made to portray the operations of the Kiga group as a capitalist production line, imagery that's also used to depict the child broiler. Penguindrum creates visual parallels between us and them in order to reveal how one arises from the other. The Kiga group is not an outside entity sneaking into society, but is instead shaped by the same forces that dominate society as a whole: capitalism, hierarchy, and alienation. Anonymity, or invisibility, is explored extensively in Penguindrum. When Tabuki is on his way to the child broiler, he ponders that if he disappears, he'll at least be free of his mother and of piano, things that have been plaguing his life. Thus, in Penguindrum, invisibility takes away all the things that make a person unique, including the painful things, allowing them to put their head down and survive in the frozen world. The faceless masses of unpersons may seem to have resigned themselves, but they must have an outlet for their collective rage and lack of fulfillment. In Underground, Murakami notes that it's unreasonable to expect anyone to accept being an unimportant little person, just a cog in society's system, gradually worn away until death. It's understandable that people search for a higher purpose and meaning, but it's precisely at this point where a kind of fatal mistake can be made. At the end of episode 23 of Penguindrum, the Black Bunnies reveal the motives for some of the invisible Kiga group members. They seek to finally be noticed, to get revenge on the world that never needed them. Thus, Penguindrum posits that no alternative has been offered to the masses that gives them a path other than total conformity or reactive rebellion. Even Sanetoshi has a foil, Himari's doctor. As Sanetoshi's normal counterpart, he has none of the same flair. Sanetoshi's design marks him as a main character, with his flashy coat and long pink hair, but Dr. Washizuka is plain in appearance. Though he's not malicious, he's nonetheless portrayed as completely out of touch. He can't hold a conversation, he has no empathy for anyone suffering in the for-profit medical system, and he's shown to be connected to the Kiga group without even knowing it, highlighting his ignorance. A contrast between his uptight rationalism and Sanetoshi's mysticism is also drawn. In Underground, Murakami described how quick people were to dismiss Ulm's belief system as crazy, but then asked, were we, as a society, able to offer them a more viable narrative? Did we have a narrative potent enough to chase away Asahara's utter nonsense? This is the relevant point regarding Dr. Washizuka. He isn't a criminal, nor a terrorist, yet it's understandable why Kamba prefers to listen to Sanetoshi over him. Kamba is drawn to the Kiga group because it gives him an outlet for his feelings of rage and impotence. All Dr. Washizuka can offer him is cold indifference. Sanetoshi is the embodiment of the curse handed down to the main characters, the force that tries to pull them away from connection and towards extremism. Given that society doesn't offer them a better option, what are they to do? In a conversation with mangaka Takemiya-Keiko, Ikuhara said the following: I hear often that in the 80s, our city theory was to burn everything, but in the 90s we couldn't fathom resolving a story that way, especially after Ulm. So, despite having grown up in a time of radical politics, Ikuhara became unable to write a story where the resolution was to destroy society. How exactly does this play out in Penguindrum? After all, one of its main themes is that the world is unfair. This fact truly cannot be overturned. Another major theme is family. At the start of the narrative, each character is clinging to a family bond, which they secretly feel is fake or otherwise fragile. The Takakura siblings are not blood-related, and they have to walk on eggshells to avoid difficult topics. Ringo feels that only by becoming the sister she lost will she be able to restore her shattered family. Tabuki and Yuri get engaged and subsequently married, with the loss of Momika seeming to be the only thing they have in common. Over the course of the narrative, these relationships are tested and ultimately broken. The characters all lose what they feel should never be lost. But it wasn't Ikuhara's intention to write a story about family disintegration. Penguindrum features various examples of family members harming one another, whether indirectly like the Takakura parents, or directly like the Natsume grandfather. Penguindrum has often been thought of as criticizing the nuclear family. However, the conclusion of the story is neither the world is unfair, so it should just burn, nor families are the site of much suffering, therefore we may as well not have them. In an interview on Penguindrum, Ikuhara stated, "Well, my own dream is that I want to see a story of reaffirmation, showing that children can take a terrible community that's been built and build their own new community on top of it. And I don't want this point to be misunderstood. I'm not trying to show that first terrible community in a positive light, but I also simply can't accept a portrayal that shuts the door on it and says, this has nothing to do with us. I don't want to make a sketchy generalization like most of the media do, that says simply, this is evil. The student movement was about rejecting the nation, but at the same time, it was a rejection of their parents' generation, a rejection of their own families. Forming your own community through rejecting another, defending your own position through rejection of the outmoded. I don't want to make a story like that. Rather, what I want to show is the feeling of, we still love our mother and father who did those things, even if they may have been wrong to do them." This passage should clarify the aims of the story. In order to build a better community, a better family, the characters can't just deny where they came from. Shoma attempts to do this throughout the story, wanting to forget his parents, but by doing so, he's in turn rejecting his siblings. It's unfair that he has to live with the Takakura parents' legacy, but only by embracing it can he rediscover the family he's always sought. Things look dire in the final episodes. The truth comes out, leaving the Takakura siblings devastated. Kamba leaves the family and commits acts of terrorism, despite the pleas of his loved ones. It looks as though the events of 1995 will repeat themselves. Life, unfair and cruel, has given fate's children nothing but punishment. But at the end of everything, Himari finally speaks her mind. She is a part of the family too. Of course it's her brother's duty to look out for her, but they were denying her ability to look after them. As it turns out, living was a punishment, she says. I've been punished in small doses, living as a Takakura. Yet she accepts this punishment as the price of getting to live together with her brothers. This is Penguindrum's answer to the problem of suffering. Love and connection come with risk. For people like Sanetoshi, the risk is not worth it. Episode 20 reveals him as a character who would prefer to fruitlessly chase pleasure forever, since love may not even be real. But Penguindrum's protagonists are willing to commit to life. They'll suffer through anything, as long as they're able to be together. Sanetoshi believed that causing destruction would allow him to break free from the box of the self. But in the final episode of Penguindrum, Shoma and Kamba truly accomplish this, not by sacrificing others, but by sacrificing themselves. And they don't do it alone. It requires the willingness of all the characters to share the fruit of fate, their very lives. In doing so, they avert a second disaster and achieve a communion which will endure beyond death. Despite its hopeful ending, Penguindrum leaves open the fact that the train may come again. Society itself has not changed enough to prevent extremist movements from gaining prominence. But it doesn't tell its audience to resign to the status quo. Instead, it posits that we can find a way out, together. What that way out looks like is not clear, but one thing is certain. No social order or reactionary leader has the right to decide our fate. We must find our destiny for ourselves.